Hey, is this thing on? Hello? Hit it again. I think it's on now. Welcome to Hiker Trash Radio, where each week, Doc will drag some colorful characters out of the woods to talk trail and Type 2 fun. If you're aspiring hiker trash, or if you're just looking to understand the hiker trash in your life, look no further. So lace up those boots, gnaw on some jerky, and settle into your 20-mile pace as we fire up the podcast from somewhere deep in the backcountry. It's time to embrace the suck.
Welcome back to another week on the trail. Dirtbags, hiker trash, and of course, those good-smelling day hikers. I'm Doc, and this is Hiker Trash Radio. Hey, if you like what we're doing here, take just a minute and help us out. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you don't like what we're doing, just keep that to yourself. All right, we have a very special bonus episode for you this week. One in a continuing series on one of my favorite topics, the Barkley Marathons. And we are fortunate enough to have on the podcast today record 4-time finisher Jared Campbell. Welcome to Hiker Trash Radio, Jared. How's it going?
It's going really well. Thanks a lot. I'm excited to be here.
And, you know, in our pre-talk, I neglected to offer my congratulations. What an accomplishment just to finish the Barkley one time, let alone 4 times. Well done, sir.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been quite a journey over the years.
And we're going to talk about that in just a bit. And I want everybody to kind of settle in and get ready. Have your pencils ready, because we are offering college credit tonight from Hiker Trash Radio University in the subject area of the Barkley Marathons. 5 university credits for anybody who completes the series. So are you ready for this?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit. I know a lot of my regular listeners are very familiar with the Barkley because I talk about it any chance I get. But let's talk about it for some of those listeners who are tuning in, expecting to hear something about through hiking, and all of a sudden we're talking about this thing called the Barkley. So the Barkley's in its current format, I believe it started in 1989. And since that time, we've had 26 finishes by 20 different racers. That in itself is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think that's one of the things that draws a lot of folks to it is just the duration, you know, as long as it's been going on, the number of people that have tried it, of different backgrounds, right? And then the low finishing rate, right? I think for a lot of people, at least the folks that end up really wanting to go do it, they're drawn into the fact that it has such a low success rate historically.
Yes. Now, in addition to the number of finishes and finishers, the Barkley is a very quirky race. There's a lot of mystique surrounding the race. I'm just going to mention a few of them. One is there's a top secret application process. I mean, if you talk to any one of the racers, and I've talked to many of them, I've had them on the show, I've put them on the spot, I've asked them for the application process, and they are mum. They will not give it up. They don't want to be blackballed. They want to return to race. And so you really have to be creative and clever to try and figure out how to actually even apply to the Barkley. Also in the Barkley, no GPS allowed. I mean, you're on your own out there. You've got a watch, a compass, and a map. And, you have to copy the map by hand, the official race course map. Laz puts it out on a picnic table. You copy it down and do your best. Another quirk, there's no published start time. The racers show up. They're not sure exactly when the race is going to start. And they kind of have a 12-hour window, I understand. And then Laz will blow the conch, right? And that conch, blowing of the conch, that signals, 1 hour until race time. And then the race does not start with a starter pistol or a whistle. It starts with the lighting of a cigarette. No aid stations out there. No aid stations out there. There are 15 books along the route to help prove that you actually visited every portion of the course. And there's a time limit, 60 hours. 60 hours to go what some people have said is probably close to 100 miles. Because there's really no published distance either. And so what comes into play?
Yep.
Yes, what comes into play is Sleep deprivation, navigation, the weather can play a big part, both in a negative fashion and in a positive fashion. We saw it in a very positive fashion this past race in 2024. And I talked to Eeyore Varies, and he told me his opinion was that just looking at the finishers, smart people tend to finish the Barkley. It is a smart person's ultra run. You have to use your noggin out there. You have to be aware. And so I want to ask you, Jared, is the Barkley some kind of demented IQ test?
I think there's a tendency to look at it in lots of different bizarre ways, but I mean, I see it as a really interesting filtration mechanism. Like all of the funny oddities that you mentioned kind of filter out from general humanity, like this pretty tiny little subset of people that are not afraid by the odds that are stacked against them, people that know how to do their homework, research obsessively. I think that's why you have a pretty academic community that goes after it. It's like a big class or a whole, learning this whole thing is it's different than any other race in the sense that you really have to go do your homework because nothing about it is obvious. Everything from the registration application process that you mentioned all the way through when you're even executing the race, right? Nothing's laid out and handed to you, where in our society, so many things are just, people are just expect to have a protocol laid out for how to do everything, right? And so I think a big part of why it's so interesting to me, well, I think it's just set up to be a filtration mechanism for humanity, and it just naturally precipitates out the type of people that it should have there, and I love that about it. If you're fortunate to be in the park right before the race and during the race, you kind of look around and go, wow, like, the whole process it took just to get there resulted in the people that you're surrounded with in camp. I want to get to know these people because they're probably pretty interesting. I'm really inspired and drawn to the people that end up making it there.
I love that description, a filtration system for humanity. And what you're left with are these obsessive types who do a lot of research and are able to get past the fact that nothing is obvious. Jared, if we had a world-class athlete who was not obsessively researching the race, the course, past history of the race, a world-class athlete shows up, gets admitted, gets a condolence letter, and shows up to the start line, how does that person do?
It depends. Because let's say you are the best person in the world, the fittest, fastest person in the world. Maybe you've got an amazing track record of endurance. If you don't show up and still understand a few basic things, like what that first year looks like to you, and you just sort of take off the start line. And I think it's happened. We've had some really fast people show up there over the years. It never ends up going very well. I guess I could go into, it's never gone very well for people because part of understanding what that first year means for you, even if you're the best in the world, means you have a plan and a strategy, and you're teaming up and you're pairing with people, and you're respecting the fact that that first year is pretty unique in terms of what your experience is and how you approach it. At almost any other race, you probably could just take off. If the trail was marked and it's laid out in front of you and you just zip through the whole course, you could lead off the pack and just run to the finish. That happens in almost every other race, but not the Barkley. If you took off, it probably would just end with you lost in the woods pretty fast.
Yeah, we've got the Cocodona coming up in a few weeks, and a lot of people are training for that. That is a level of insanity unto itself, 250-mile race, trail race. But the Barkley, a whole nother dimension of insanity. And so I agree. From what I know, from people I've talked to, from what I've heard, you can't just show up as a world-class athlete without having done some homework and expect to have any kind of success out there. Very, very difficult. All right. Yeah. Hey, Jared, have you had a chance to listen to the podcast before?
I haven't.
That's okay. I always enjoy my guests who have no idea what they're getting themselves into. This is going to be a lot of fun. I want to just point out to you that we do have a regular segment towards the end of every episode called the hiking hack. And that's where I'm going to turn to you and ask you to share some trail wisdom with our listeners to make their next outdoor experience even better. We'll see if we find something maybe that you take out there on the trail on the Barkley that maybe they can apply to other, less insane hikes out there.
Sounds good.
Okay. Hey, let's get to our first segment.
Trailblazers Toolkit.
That's right. It's time for the Trailblazers Toolkit, sponsored by the ultralight backpacking gear company 6 Moon Designs. Now, I love to talk about gear on the podcast, Jared, and I love to hear about the most important item in my guest adventure gear. So if you were preparing for your next adventure, say next year's Barkley, and I was the one providing you with all your gear, what is the one specific piece of gear you would insist on being packed? Give me all the details on that piece of gear. Tell me why you've got to have it out there. And this can be any kind of item. It could be gear. It could be apparel. It could be a luxury item. I use that with thru hikers, but I don't know that maybe you'd have a luxury item on the Barkley. So, Jared, what is that item in your toolkit?
Well, for something like the Barkley, I mean, if you're asking your question in the context of Barkley, where it's limited what you can and can't bring, right? I think my answer is going to be different for Barkley versus other things. But I mean, footwear, if you had nothing else, you got to have the right footwear dialed. So, I mean, you could run off naked into the woods with the right socks and shoes, and you could probably make it pretty far. Which is to say, if you didn't have that gear, you'd get nowhere, especially on a course like that, which is so, rocky, rooty, scratchy. So the footwear absolutely has to be something that's dialed and works for you, and I don't think everyone's got their own thing and their own shape of foot, etc. You really got to figure out what type of shoe you're going to be able to wear for a long ass time for 60 miles, right? Or 60 hours, excuse me.
60 hours.
A lot more than 60 miles. So yeah, I mean, that's it for me. Everything else is kind of important, but secondary.
And what is that footwear for you, that specific footwear?
Well, I ran for La Sportiva as an athlete for many years, which is great. I love their footwear. I tend to run in a Salomon shoe nowadays. I don't have an affiliation with La Sportiva. And so I'm able to kind of test out and work with what I want. So I wore the Sense Ride, I think Sense Ride 5, I believe, for all of the Barkley this year. Footwear's key. I mean, that's maybe a pretty standard answer, and maybe you'd go, well, yeah, duh, footwear. So maybe just to expand my answer a little bit, one of my favorite pieces of gear, even on the Barkley, because you can bring it, is a filter, like a bee-free, Katadyn bee-free water filter. That's a really important piece of gear that I use both at Barkley and outside on my own adventures and stuff. Pretty game changer in my opinion, being able to source water just about anywhere, have pretty high confidence in its filtration. You're not starting Barkley with 4 liters of water because you can get water out there. So that's a piece of gear that I really, really like.
Yeah, and there seems to be only one water resupply out there, right? With the water at Ratjaw.
There's one provided water supply, yeah. Well, at the top of the tower, which is kind of really the only spot outside of the camp that you ever see imagery, like the general public pretty much thinks Barkley takes place in a campground and at the top of a tower. But in reality, I don't even really think too much about that water stop because there's streams in many places throughout the course where you can source water. There's places you don't want to as well due to some mining and things of that nature, but you can get water in quite a few spots.
Now, do most Barkley runners carry a water filter?
I think they do now, and over the years. And if you do your homework, you kind of learn, oh, great, I could bring a filter like the Be Free and, only need to have one bottle with me, even on a dry year. Whereas people who didn't do that research might start with however much water they think they need to get from the start to the tower. And like the slower folks there might take 8 hours to get there, maybe more. And so it's like, dang, water for 8 hours, how much is that? Could be a lot. And so all of a sudden you have someone who's maybe on the slower part of the pack who's got, a lot of water weight with them, and it's further slowing them down. So I think that's a really, really key piece for the Barkley and for fast packing and for trail running.
Yeah, I carry a lot of water weight just in general in life. So yeah, that's my issue. Hey, before we get too far down the trail with the Barkley, let's back up a little bit. I'd love to hear about your background and where you grew up, what kinds of sports and hobbies you were involved in as a kid, and how in the world did you get involved in the ultra running cult?
Okay. I'll try to give you the quick answer to all of that. I live in Park City, Utah now, just outside of Salt Lake City. I've been in the area my whole life. Living in the Wasatch Mountains, minutes away from my house, from my career, able to jump into the mountains. And that's I think I was fortunate to be born here, and it's very intentional that I still live here because I love place. It matters a lot to me. And as a young kid in my teens and 20s, I was a rock climber. That was kind of my focus. And it was really a great way to grow up. I had a lot of friends that were older than me, and that meant they could drive places when I couldn't. And that meant that I was traveling all over the world, really, to rock climb. And so before I was a runner, I was a climber. I didn't come into long distance trail running as a runner. I actually came into it as a climber, someone who did a lot of sport climbing and trad climbing and aid climbing and every type of climbing, which eventually led into linking up, connecting peaks on really, really technical terrain, like linking up peaks in the Grand Tetons, like the Grand Traverse, the Cirque of the Tower Traverse, and the Wind Rivers. I did a bunch in the Sierra Nevadas. So my climbing kind of morphed into these 10, 15, 20, 25-hour days of climbing, and there's an inherent component of like fitness, aerobic capacity, et cetera, that comes when you do that type of stuff, right? And so when I was a engineering student at University of Utah here in Salt Lake City, I was working in a lab for a professor who kind of became a mentor of mine and played a role in me transitioning from a climber to a runner. So I was doing these 20 plus hour link ups mostly as a climber, at least in my mind. And I'm looking at him going, well, you're doing a 24-hour 100-mile race called the Wasatch 100. That sounds horrible. And I said, I kind of scratched my head a little bit. I'm like, but it's really not too different for what I'm doing. I mean, it's not as technical. You're just shuffling down a trail, but you're doing it for about the same amount of time. Some of the components about eating and drinking, I kind of have to do that when I'm in the Tetons or the Wind Rivers. So what the heck? Why don't I give it a try? And so I kind of jumped in the deep end to really just see how would it translate moving from maybe you'd say an endurance climber to a trail runner. And so it started as a interest in proving to myself I could do this 100-mile kind of thing. But then so many things went wrong, as always does, when you're in an activity that takes a day or more, that you inevitably come out the other end going, wow, there's 100 things I could do better, or could have done better, should have done better. I should try again. Right? And so thus starts the sickness, where you start to sign up for the next race, where maybe your list of things you did wrong shrinks by a little bit. And then, you find yourself over 20 years later, like I do here, still hacking away at it. Right? And I've gotten a lot better at things and figured out systems and methods and approaches, training and other things, but still always in a mindset of learning and growing and adapting. So anyway, that's my background in a nutshell. I still live here. I'm married. I have 2 daughters, 7 and 10 years old. And from pretty early ages, they've been dragged up mountains and on the ends of ropes climbing and canyoneering and all sorts of fun things. So whether they like it or not, they get, taken outside a lot. My wife too is a really similar background to me, climber, runner. And so we're on the same page when it comes to what we do with our free time.
Any aspirations for her to run the Barkley?
My wife?
Yes.
No. I think that became clear. She's awesome. I mean, she's incredible and super tough. And she was out there crewing me this year. And at the end, I actually think I said to her, okay, now it's your turn. And she's like, Oh, hell no. She's a lot smarter than me, so I don't think she'd quite sign up for it.
Now, any siblings?
Yes, I have two sisters. Yep.
And are they also runners?
No. Yeah. Yeah. Nope. I mean, a little bit. They do a little bit outside. They'll support and be part of things I've done. They're amazing supporters of the things I've done over the years. I put on a handful of races, and they're always out there helping and volunteering and stuff, and sometimes participating, but they're not very serious about it.
They're serious about supporting you, which is the important part.
Yeah, they're great.
All right. And you mentioned engineering. Is that your day job?
Yes. Yep.
And how do you fit in training for the Barkley and other races around a job in engineering?
Yeah, it's a heck of a challenge, honestly. Yeah, at this stage too, I have my like demands from my professional career seem to just expand over time. Then add kids to the mix and a partnership and a house and all sorts of standard things. So boy, has that become the answer to that question is really the crux for me at this point is how do I make it all happen? And I think back to what my life was like when I was 20, let's say, or early 20s doing this stuff. And I didn't realize how sort of inefficient I was with my time. And as complexity goes up, either you let things, fall off your plate and just say, I'm not gonna be, physically active anymore, which is what most, Americans do. Or you say, boy, this is a really important part of my identity. How do I fit it in? And that means a lot of early mornings. That means bizarre late nights. That means really maximizing your weekends. And somehow you make it happen. And thankfully, the key is that I have a partner who's, supportive and into it. She has her own identity as well. And then, like the comment I mentioned earlier about shared sort of thoughts on what we do with our free time, that really, really helps when on a weekend, we go somewhere as a family and then she sneaks away or I sneak away for a good chunk of that to get in a training run. But I will admit it's hard. I mean, I don't sleep as much as most people as a result. So
a lot going on.
Yeah, I feel like my commitments are hopefully at a peak point in my life right now because there's times when I want to crack.
But if nobody's complaining, I mean, you must be doing the right things. So
yeah, surround yourself with great people and learn how to have people help you and reach out and delegate in places where you can, and somehow you make it work. I mean, this year, and especially pulling off Barkley with where my life's at right now, was really extra satisfying to me because I started to wonder, is it even possible for me to do this at this stage in life? So wow, was it awesome to finish. Great.
Yes, fantastic. Let's talk about the Barkley now. Let's get to it. Multiple big news stories out of Frozen Head this year. A lot of big things happened. We had 5 finishers for the first time. We had our first 4-time finisher in Jared Campbell. We had our first female finisher in Jasmine Paris. We had John Kelly's 3rd finish. We had a brand new section added to the race this year. We had 2 contestants whom I haven't been able to determine who they are, who evidently littered at the beginning of the race. I don't know if that's ever been tracked down, but that was surprising news that they possibly could be disqualified. I had not heard that about the race before. And then we have a new race director for next year. I understand Laz is stepping down and Carl Laniak is going to be taking over the reins as race director for the Barkley.
Yeah, on that final point, I mean, I don't know it to be like this total handoff kind of thing. Carl, for those who know, has been a figure in the race's history for, I think, more than 20 years. And I think he really stepped in to just help Laz and did an amazing job with it. I think he's a great fit to help. But I don't believe that there's this official handoff. So if that is a rumor going around, I don't quite know that's true. But I think he has stepped in to help with some of the logistics and the planning and hiding books and things of that nature.
Okay, well, we'll leave it as a rumor at this point. I thought I had it on pretty good authority that was going to happen. We'll have to wait until next year to see if that actually takes place. So stay tuned for that. Now let's talk about your approach to the Barkley. And I have a question before we get to that. Do finishers get an automatic entry into the following year?
Well,
are you allowed to say if that is true or not?
Such a rule is not really written anywhere, but I mean, I think that past finishers have always had, a pretty good path to getting in. Yeah. But there's a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of cryptic, quiet things that someone like me would not say about like the entry process. I get asked all the time, but I will say there's also a lot of things that are not even clear to us, who you might assume know the event inside and out. And even some of the rules, the entry process, is it a guarantee that a past finisher gets in? Even that's, it's not written down and formalized anywhere.
Okay.
So I guess I'll say that.
That's interesting. It's more of the Barkley mystique. Even the vets, there's still a lot of mystery in their minds as well. Now, how did you approach this year's Barkley? What was your strategy going in?
Like leading up to it, or once I was in and there?
Let's break it into two parts. How did you train? What was your prep prior to getting to Frozen Head? And then once you got on the course, was it you're going to get out and you're going to lead? You're going to stay with a group? What was your take on that?
Okay, so I guess the prep part of it. I mean, I feel like I've developed a pretty good approach for myself where I know when I'm physically ready, and then also when I'm mentally ready. And they're related, but different. One's easy to measure, right? I think it's easy to put in a spreadsheet certain metrics you want to hit for distance, for vertical gain, big days out, etc. I mean, to me, we can talk about that if you want, but really at the end of the day, it's about sort of building up your body, and Barkley is so steep up and down that I always kind of recommend that people who are in like really put a lot of focus into ascending and descending, and almost even not think about running distance, right? If you were like, I got to do 100 and whatever miles a week, the only way to really achieve that, especially if you've got a busy life, is to run kind of flat, fast stuff so you can get it all in. So I actually turn my brain off on distance. I don't even really care, because if I did, it would probably be a stressor to me to go, crap, I only did 53 miles or, some number like that, which numerically might be like, dang, how can that possibly be enough when I'm doing this crazy long thing? And so it's like, I try to not even focus on distance. I really focus on up and down, because the whole race is up and down. And so for me, I kind of build up, and I do measure it, and I track things, and I'm spreadsheet based and all that fun stuff, but I build up a certain amount of volume, mainly to get your body able to handle big days. And then I absolutely make sure that I have 3, maybe 4 big days, which to me is like a 24-hour day, let's call it, with mostly steep terrain. And I feel like at this point, if I can get that in, I'm feeling pretty good physically. Much more than that, and I find, as I have found in the past, I can easily get injured if I push it too far. If I try to do a 40-hour day with 73,000 feet of vertical in one run, like I could go do that, but the probability of it being counterproductive because I break myself is really high. And so for me, it's building up so that your body can handle a 24-hour day. And I got a handful in this year. I was able to run a race that I put on called Running Up for Air. It's a 24-hour thing. And I had done several big days leading up to that, and I handled that amazingly. I came out the other end. I even was like, had my race director hat on for a part of it. We had to fix a broken tent and shuttle vans that were sliding off the road. So I jumped out of the race, took care of that for 3 hours, put my shoes back on, and ran for another 20 hours. And I came out, having done 30,000+ feet of vert and running for a day, solving problems. And I'm like, I feel pretty good. And I had a handful of other days that I'd organized myself, including a big fun day. Also, I always try to weave in a really fun but long time on your feet day out in the desert. That's, Southern Utah kind of thing. And so I kind of checked all my big boxes. I built up a handful of big days, big fun time on feet. And it's like, that's enough. I've kind of learned physically to get by. And then, because you can easily just think that you get ready by just training yourself to death, and then you'll probably get injured, and then you probably drop out of the race because you hurt something. So it can be counterproductive. The physical part, I think, can get you through the first half of the race, maybe through lap 3, and really to get to the end of all 5 is completely mental. And so somehow you have to learn enough about yourself to know. For me, I don't know how to describe it, but I can almost feel that I've done enough and built enough confidence to know that when all those things in your mind are saying you should stop, it's so easy to come up with a list of 100 reasons why you should stop after lap 3 and lap 4. It's just how it is. And so somehow you have to be able to say, have I built my mind up enough to be able to work to counter those voices in your head that are all saying you should stop? And I don't know how to describe it, but I can kind of feel it. And that getting to that point mentally comes from doing a lot of things and, checking those boxes that you've told yourself in your head, I'll be ready when I do this. But anyway, I went into it physically prepared enough, and I was pleased with it, given everything else in my life. And then mentally also really in a good headspace. And I really, really, really wanted it this year too. That's important. And I wanted it for a number of reasons, but I really wanted to be able to close the Barkley chapter on a high note. I really wanted to finish. I didn't the prior several attempts. And man, did it mean a lot to me and my wife, who is out there, both of us who wanted to close this chapter.
So Jared, hang on. When you say close this chapter, does this mean that you are officially done with the Barkleys?
Yeah, I am done. Yep. As a participant. Yep. I mean, I'll always be close to the event, but yeah, I think back to my repeated comments about complexity in life and family and stuff, there's really other areas I need to be putting my time. And I'm so glad I was able to finish on a high note. Yeah, and I couldn't be happier with how this year played out, but it's my intent to not take up another spot going forward.
Okay. And that is a great stopping point. Congratulations on finishing on a high. When we come back from break, we're going to get into race days, and talk about the events that took place in Frozen Head State Park this year. So stay tuned for that. We'll be right back. And welcome back. We were talking to 4-time Barkley finisher Jared Campbell, and we've heard a lot about his background and his prep for getting ready for the Barkley. Let's talk about that first day, maybe even the day before the race. How early do you get to Frozen Head prior to the start of the race?
It might shock you how late I arrive. I think I was the last person to officially check in. And in fact, Carl Laniak, who we talked about before, was there with this little clipboard and going down the list, and I think starting to wonder if I was even, if I missed my flight or something. So I get there pretty late. Part of it's out of just, again, complexity of life. It's like, dang, I don't really have the time to spend. Some folks go out for days and weeks in advance and learn the park and try to get in the zone there and whatnot. But for me, I think we took the latest flight out I could. We stayed in Nashville. It's either Knoxville or Nashville that you fly into. We went to Nashville, which is a couple hours away. We stayed there. We got there late at night, 10, 11 at night, woke up in the morning, packed, jumped in our car, and drove the 2+ hours to Frozen Head. Midday. I think we got there at 1 or 2 p.m. The map had been put out. And like I say, I was the last one there. And to some extent, it is a little bit by design, because if you're there for days in advance, you look around and you just have time to sit. You might think that you show up there to find time to get calm and get in the headspace and whatnot. But actually what I observe is that people spend that time just building up anxiety and a little bit of fear. And when they roll out the map that you mentioned, everyone's buzzing around it like moths to a flame, and it's kind of chaos and, pandemonium a little bit, which, showing up kind of late was worked to my advantage. I sort of got there at the end. I checked in. I didn't have to wait in line. And I'm, now I had a lot to do in that little window of time that I had between when I arrived and when you go to bed. I only had a handful of hours, but I have a system that works pretty well to pack everything, to get it ready, to do whatever mapping and, coming up with bearings and stuff that I do. So short answer is I didn't have a lot of time there in camp.
And you mentioned earlier about allowable items on the course. Are you allowed to share any more than the watch that Laz gives out, and the compass, the map, of course, and your water filter? Are there other items that you can share?
Yeah, I think people could probably learn from all the documentaries and stuff, all the things, most of them. It's more a list of banned things, I would say, right? And the list of what you can bring is largely up to you. And so it's more a list of, hey, you can't have this, you can't have technology, you can't have a watch, don't GPS, no altimeter, essentially no technology. You're given this crappy watch, which was an analog pocket watch, for 1 year, which is hilarious. Now it's this $7 piece of crap digital watch that's marginally useful. But anyway, so it's really what you can't have: no technology, no music. There's literally nothing electronic that you're allowed to bring, with the exception of, in the case of this year, a pretty dorky digital watch. But then beyond that, another Barkleyism is there's no list of required gear. And every hard mountain ultramarathon in the world, I would wager to bet, has a list of, you got to have all these things, and we're going to check them. Every 10 miles, we're going to ruffle through your bag and make sure you have this whole laundry list of things. And, that's, as if you're putting on the race, you're the race director, you sort of have to do that for legal reasons and safety reasons and all this stuff. Barkley's the only race I know of that's totally up to you. You can't bring these few things, but then whatever else you decide is completely up to you.
Yeah, the Barkley, as you said earlier, it's this huge filtration system for humanity, and you end up with people out there who has there ever been a medical evac from Barkley?
I don't think there has.
Which is wild in itself, because the conditions of the course and the weather some years is just absolutely brutal.
Yeah. And there have been several instances where folks have been late on returning from a loop on the order of approaching 30 hours. And then they started to talk around the camp about assembling a search and rescue team. So if you do that homework, what a story like that tells you is, I really have to be able to take care of myself, because they may not come looking for me for 30 hours. Now, the opposite of that is a race where you have if you push a button on a spot tracker or an inReach, you've got a helicopter there to pick you up in 10 minutes, And so I love that Barkley's this completely different experiment in how to conduct a race. And the result is, surprisingly, maybe even counterintuitively, people show up more prepared than any other race I've ever seen. And yet there's not a single thing really defined on what you should bring or have to bring. There's nothing. And so in the absence of any real information and guidelines, and in the absence of a template laid out for you on how to be successful, the people I think who end up getting in, who are filtered through, go, crap, I got to do some research, because it's not laid out for me. And then they do a ton of homework, and then they show up really, really, really prepared. With maybe there's a few exceptions I can think of right now in my head, but for the most part, 99% of people show up having done a lot of homework and really prepared. So the absence of a list that says, bring all these things and your space blanket and your, whatever, 2,000 calories of food and all the funny things that show up in required gear lists, the absence of that appears to be people are actually more prepared. Isn't that fascinating?
It is. You took the word right out of my mouth. I was going to say fascinating. And there are a lot of analogies to the real world that we could make in terms of people who are spoon-fed a lot of information and rely on others a great deal of their lives and how they perform in life, as opposed to those who are really well-versed in self-reliance.
I totally agree. Yeah, there's a lot of. It's kind of why I like to talk about this part of Barkley too, is because I hope that it makes us think about it differently, and then extend that into other elements of our life. There's lots of other elements, because there's a tendency for society to become risk averse and feel like we address the risk of whatever, fill in the blank. We address the risk with rules and lists and all these sort of guardrails and boundaries on how to prevent the risk. And Barkley says, screw all that. I'm going to give you no guardrails aside from a few things you can't have, and then you figure out the rest. And the result is 30 plus years, almost 40 years of people running a crazy race with endless opportunities to have issues go, to get hurt, and no major disasters out there. It's pretty fascinating to me.
Yes, absolutely. Now, we've said multiple times, this is the fourth time you have finished the Barkley. I don't know how many times you've entered the Barkley. How many times have you run?
I think I've started 8 times.
So you are like the Tom Brady of the Barkley Marathons. Tom Brady played 20 years, and 10 years he made it to the Super Bowl. And so you very similarly, you've run 8 times and you finished 4 times. That is a 50% completion rate, which is just bonkers.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think of the years I didn't finish, I believe I have 3 fun run finishes. And then 1 year, I absolutely destroyed my ankle, like 3 miles in that year. Just, not just kind of a little sprain or a little roll, just like terrible. And then I hopped my way on like 1 foot and like some makeshift poles to the finish. So I hopped a lap too. I've got a good hop lap.
I was gonna ask of the 8 races, what was the toughest moment out there? Was that the toughest moment, being limited to 1 foot?
No, I don't think so. I mean, tough in some ways because you're facing the reality that, wow, did the race take a turn in a direction I did not anticipate, and like accepting the reality of that, and it's really bizarre. That first lap, at least for me, I feel like I try to get in such a headspace, this like unbelievable commitment headspace where it's like nothing will stop me unless, bones are sticking out of my body. Like I'm just committed, And so even when I had this pretty catastrophic ankle roll, it took a few hours for me to like admit to myself, like, I might not be able to finish this, and it really, as I worked my way through that lap, eventually it was pretty obvious I was losing some time, but I hopped pretty fast on 1 leg. So like that was hard in some ways, psychologically or mentally or whatever. But I think definitely the low points for me have been on different years, battling different elements of it. Usually lap 3 or 4 is pretty hard because everything's piling up, all the physical wear and tear on your body. Usually that second night, wherever that falls, is like the crux, I think, of the race, because you're just exhausted. It's dark. You're probably getting lost and making stupid navigational decisions. And that's when your mind just comes up with all the reasons of what am I doing? And every year that happens. And then if you throw at that, really bad weather, I've had years where it's rained for, 30 hours straight. 1 year it snowed a little bit. So I've had kind of that combination of like physical breakdown, mental breakdown, and then like bad enough weather that's like I can't afford to stop. Like I have to move, otherwise I'm going to freeze to death out here. I've had that quite a few times. And so like I would describe that as maybe the hardest. If you could sort of combine all those factors, like that represents like the hardest moment I've ever been in.
Understandable. Now, aside from the bad moments out there, what's your favorite Barkley memory from the 8?
Yeah.
Can you distill it down to one memory, or are there a couple that stand out?
There's quite a few, but I think probably my first year. My first year, I remember on the lap 5, so the last lap, and I had 1 climb left. Yeah, so it was the final climb of lap 5, and I had time, so I wasn't worried about finishing. I knew I'd get there, but I was worked, and all the things you should be that far into lap 5. Anyway, I just remember kind of laying down and really I'm not really a hallucinator, right? People have lots of stories about hallucinating and stuff, but I remember just really being like in another planet, kind of laying down by a stream, and I was hearing voices in the stream, and the wind was like super vivid, like the way the trees were moving. It was like they took on almost a life form, in the sense that they were like, I almost felt like I was communicating with them, or at least listening, and I was just fascinated by it. And I really loved it. Like everything was stripped away, and I just felt like on this hyper aware from a sensory standpoint, I was out of it in lots of ways, but like in a sense, all of the noise of reality or your normal life sort of faded away. And I just was really immersed in the environment in a way I don't know if I've ever quite felt that. So I loved that moment. I had a similar moment in 2014, a year I finished also, where I ran the whole thing by myself. And I was a very new father at that point in time. I think my daughter was born like 4 months earlier. I have to think that's actually probably my single most best feeling, because I was in a same broke down state, and it was like what really matters in life, and like so almost like the perspective that moment gave me about how excited I am to see and hold my daughter, how excited I am and how much I love my wife. Like when everything's stripped away, you go, what really matters? And in a way, my wife wasn't out there, nor was my daughter, but I felt more connected to them, and like I valued them more than I ever have in my life. And it was because I was stripped down and in that interesting state of mind. I loved that. And then when I finished and flew home and met them, it's like that connection, just that simple hug, meant more than it does. When I go home today, I'll take for granted and a simple little hug, but man, did it matter to me when I got home because of where I had been mentally and physically. And so to me, I really love that experience.
Fantastic. A lot to unpack right there. I want to go back just on a couple of items. One is you took a nap in 2012. You had some hours to spare, but having been up for 50 plus hours straight and going through that physical exertion, I would be nervous that if I laid down and closed my eyes, I'd wake up 12 hours later, and that'd be the end of the race.
Yeah, you're right. No, I did sleep that year for sure after lap 4 for quite a while, actually, like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, maybe so it was a while ago, but 12 years ago. I think it was like 2+ hours, let's say. But I did have a good friend who was out there helping me, crewing me. And so that whole concern about oversleeping, it's like, hey, wake me up, dude. At least I was in camp for over 2 hours, but slept a good chunk of that. And like waking up is super hard, to your point. But at the same time, it's, you also can't really sleep very well because you're in this like adrenaline fueled, like kind of survival mode mindset. And so once I was up, it's like, okay, shit, I got to get this done, And so you can kind of get back into the gear pretty fast. I think it's a little dangerous to sleep out on the trail, like a trail nap, because then you really could pass out for hours and throw away your whole race, So when you have someone who can wake you up, that's good.
Yeah, maybe it wasn't you took a nap on the trail, but you laid down on the trail. If I would have laid down, I would have fallen asleep. I'd have been out for 12 hours. But when I talked to Aurelian and John Kelly last year after their finish, they talked about their strategy of sleeping on top of a book because they knew that they'd be woken up by the next person to come along. And I think one of them was really frustrated because I think Jasmine came by like 4 minutes after they had laid down on the book. So they didn't get a long nap.
Yeah. You got to come up with little like tricks. Another one I've used in the past is like, if it's like, I have to sleep for a few minutes, like doing it in like the coldest spot on the course, like I'm not going to sleep where it's potentially comfy. I'm going to go in the most uncomfortable place so that I'm woken up because I'm freezing to death. And I've used that a few times to sleep like 5-10 minutes, something like that, because, your body will wake up just to survive. Yes. So that's a good one.
Now, you mentioned in 2014, you ran the entire thing alone. I wanted to ask you, as you've gone through each of the 8 attempts, did your strategy change over time? Did your approach change over time, or how did that work?
Yeah, it's definitely changed over time. My first year, you have to be with someone who can be a help and a guide, kind of. And that was my 2012, 2014. Let's see, 2013, I got really lost. Oh, that's a whole story for another podcast. 2014, I really wanted to. So my why going back after I finished the first time was I gotta see if I gotta prove it to myself. I can finish this on my own. I can navigate the thing by myself, and I can make decisions by myself for the whole time. That's what I wanted to do, and that's what I did in 2014. Essentially, right out of the gates, kind of charged out, spent the whole time by myself. But it's without going into more details than you might want. Yeah, my strategy has changed a lot over the years, including this year for sure. I took very much a more conservative mindset, going out, knowing that there'd be a lot of energy because of the talent there right out of the gates and potentially for the first lap or 2 or 3. And that proved to be the case for sure. So I think I took a smarter approach, a more measured approach, and maybe stayed more consistent throughout the laps than I had in prior years.
Okay. Well, hey, take us through lap 5 this year, loop 5. I understand there was an interaction between you and Jasmine about who was going to go out first on loop 5. I think there was some pressure. She felt some pressure to kind of get the direction that she wanted to go. And so she was trying to hurry in camp. And my understanding from what I've heard is you told her, hey, take your time. You choose which direction and you go that direction. I'm not going to force you to go a direction you don't want to go. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of it. Yeah, I mean, we just happened to be in camp at the same time. And she was in one location. She's up by the gate. I think there's movies out there of her trying to get it together, right? I mean, everyone who's in camp after lap 4 is pretty destroyed. And you're in this frame of mind of like, well, all systems are not go, It's like you're driving a car with all the lug nuts loose on the wheels and they're falling off. And so she's up by the gate dealing with where she's at. I'm in a different spot with my wife kind of getting ready. I turned around relatively quickly, but when I was a couple hundred feet away, I'm like, okay, so what's the next direction? Because I knew people had left, right? And in Barkley, I don't know if your audience knows, but when someone does start the 5th lap, which doesn't always happen, the person who leaves first picks the direction. So in this year, 5 people, well, more than 5 people start. I think 7 people started.
7, yeah,
which had never happened. So number 1 gets to pick the direction, right? And I think it was Ihor. Ihor left, and he picked clockwise. And so that first person sets this alternating, flipping direction, right? So he went clockwise. The next person goes counter. And so as you exit, in this case, 7 people left, there was an order to it based on when you left. And so I knew Jasmine was still in camp. And then I said, well, what's the next direction? Well, whoever leaves next is going clockwise. The preferred direction, primarily because of navigational reasons, would be why I'd say that. A lot easier to navigate clockwise than counterclockwise. Okay, great. So Jasmine's here. Next direction's clockwise. I was ready. Neither of us had a whole lot of time to dilly-dally. So I kind of marched up there, and she's sitting in a chair, trying to get ready. And we'd been through a lot together, some of it together and then some independently, but it's like, okay, are you ready to go? Do you have a preferred direction that you want? She says, oh, no, it doesn't matter. And you could tell she was pretty shattered at that point. And one of my good friends who was there is like, hey, Jared, she actually does want to go one direction, as you should in her shoes, right? Anyone who's trying to finish for the first time, I think, should have an opinion about it, and especially this year with the course changes. Anyway, point is, I was then able to ask her, like, are you ready to go? Because if she needed another 30 minutes or an hour, I didn't have 30 minutes or an hour to spare, so it probably would have played out differently. So I was like, hey, are you close to ready to go? And if so, and she says, yeah, I'm close. And if so, you can take whichever direction you want, which was awesome. I mean, I'm just so glad to have been there and be able to sort of offer it that way and have the experience I do to be able to go either direction myself without too much mental anxiety with either way. And so in a sense, it was good for her because it made her go, I better get ready and I better get out. So it was a little kick in the pants for her, and then, was allowed me to go shortly thereafter as well. So that's how it went down.
That's fantastic. I love hearing that. Now, tell us about life on Loop 5 this year. How did it go for you? And you came in at 59:30 and 32 seconds. Yeah. So you came in with about a half an hour to spare. What was your level of anxiety or confidence on that fifth loop, and how did it go?
Well, that's a good question. And I've not written about it or even talked about what my lap 5 was. So since you asked, so I went counterclockwise. Navigationally, it's trickier. Definitely is for me. Maybe others. I mean, it's trickier. And the reason is there's several descents that you're doing where if you get the bearing wrong, you can end up in the wrong spot. It's just a product of the way the terrain falls in that direction. And anyway, I left on lap 5. I was on a mission. I really didn't feel like I had much buffer for errors at all. And so I was hell-bent. Plus there's this fascinating, I love lap 5 because something about the finality of it brings out parts of your soul that you didn't know existed. Like you find energy to move in ways that you didn't on prior laps. It's really an amazing experience because, every step is the last. It's awesome. The psychology behind lap 5 is really cool. Anyway, I'm running, relatively speaking fast. And I was like, oh, if I can hold this pace, it would have been incredible. But 2-3 miles later, I did just collapse for I've never had something so quickly turn me into mush on the side of the trail. And I just laid down for a few minutes. Thankfully, it was only a few minutes. It was cold. Trying not to make this too long an explanation, but I completely screwed up the first opportunity to screw up. And I got to the bottom, was like, oh, crap. And I really was the most turned around I'd ever been in that spot. And as the minutes ticked by, I felt it slipping away. And I went from, I've got this, to, oh my gosh, I've completely lost all possibility of finishing in that location. I don't know the exact time that I was lost down there, but 30 minutes, maybe more, maybe 40 minutes. And eventually rationalized my way into where I was and figured out how to get back on course, find the book, etc. And I got the book page and I'm trying to do this math with a mushy brain. And I'm like, okay, I just lost time I didn't have. I really have to get it back together. And thankfully I found some weird demon energy inside of me that took me up the next hill pretty quick. Okay, I can't screw up the second descent. I screwed up the second descent. I couldn't believe it. I completely blew it again, throwing away another maybe 15 minutes. But 15 minutes I didn't have. And so between those two screw-ups, it really wasn't, I don't know, it was borderline kind of possible, but thankfully I had really good ability to go uphill, and I had this magical energy. So all the climbs I was great. From there, I didn't make any navigational mistakes. The climbs up, I was super strong. The descents, my feet were destroyed. And so it was just a matter of how do I sort of move as fast as possible as I'm hobbling on two painful stubs, is how pretty much every descent went from there. But I could climb up hill really well. And it went like that to the bitter end. Eventually I ran into Greg from New Zealand, and he must have been hurting because I passed him, got to the final climb, final descent, and I knew I had enough time, but it was pathetic, actually. If there was a video of me coming downhill, I'd be rather embarrassed by it because I was in a lot of pain. But, I was able to do the math on how much time I had. And even though 30 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, like at the last descent, I'm like, okay, I got this. And like something would really have to go wrong. So like the last handful of hours, maybe the last 2 hours, I wasn't too stressed. I knew I could pull it off. But prior to that, for most of lap 5, like I was in it, I was out of it in terms of thinking I could finish too. So I had to keep it together.
Now, did you tell yourself going into the race, this is your last race, or was it, this is going to be my last race if I finish it?
It's interesting because between 4 and 5, my wife said to me, and thankfully I wasn't like contemplating stopping. And so she's like, well, you can do it one more time, or you can come back and do it five more laps. I was like, damn. But actually, in a sense, I'm like, oh, you mean so you would support me if I came back in a subsequent year? No, I really, really needed to be done, and so that really did help me finish.
And touching that yellow gate, having completed it, knowing that this was the end of your Barkley racing days, what are the emotions going through you at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing, beautiful, cool moment. Because I finished in the daylight, which is always nice. I was pretty with it, like mentally, and able to chat with people. And so, I mean, I guess a couple of small mechanics is you're touching the gate, hoping you have all your pages and you officially finish, because it's really not over until that's been confirmed. But once you check that box off, I mean, there was a great group there, a surprisingly big group at the finish, given how few people are allowed to be there leading up to it. It was great to see that 2 other folks had finished, John and Ihor, which is awesome. So I don't know, my wife was there, gave her a hug. It just felt so good. And I was remarkably like lucid and with it. So it was a great finish. And then the best part of the whole event happened, 29
I was going to say, but before we leave Frozen Head State Park tonight, tell us about those last 30 minutes, or maybe even just the last couple of minutes of, that 60th hour. I mean, the drama that unfolded was just unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so cool. Yeah, so I mean, little mini celebration for your personal challenge and closing the chapter and all that fun stuff. Great people around. I loved it. It was awesome. I mean, the other thing I find too is like you're pretty stripped down, and even for me, to some extent, you're emotional, but at the same time, also you're so tired that it's at least for me, it's not like it comes to the surface. Anyway, my point is, I finished. It felt amazing. It was great to be there and rejoice in the moment, and then go, oh wait, where's Jasmine? And John and I are standing together, and we both look at our watches, and it's like, she has like 7 minutes left, and then 6 minutes, and then 5. And in your mind, you're going, man, the chances of her finishing are so slim at this point, because, you can see a certain distance down the road, but also there's people down the road looking for her. And if no one's really shouted, oh my gosh, she's coming, and there's 5 minutes or 4 minutes left, it's like the probability. It felt really, really slim. And so in a sense, it felt like we were all swallowing the fact that she probably wasn't going to finish. And like, that was a hard feeling, actually. And then, someone yells like, oh my gosh, there's someone coming. And you're like, well, but is it her? Is it someone else? And anyway, miraculously, it was her, as the whole world now knows. And again, John and I are like doing the math. Like, I don't know if she can pull this off, because there was like 2 minutes. Well, I don't know, 3 minutes at that point. Anyway, she comes running around the corner on a full-on mission, running as fast as you possibly can at that point. And, she did it. I mean, everyone knows at this point. And it was the coolest thing in the world. So it was like at that point, anything that had happened previously, whether it was, your own, like I finished or John or whatever, it's like none of that mattered. It all just vaporized, because that moment was so awesome for her finishing, for her as a person, but also like beyond that, like what it symbolized and what it represented. And, and for me, it maybe even it meant extra to me, just as someone who has 2 daughters and who spends a lot of time as a parent thinking about how to, put her in front of stories and heroic examples of doing awesome things. And it's like, wow, I just witnessed the most amazing thing by a woman like ever. That's amazing. And so it was an incredible. She finished, and people have seen the video. She touches the gate. She collapses. For a minute, we're like, is she alive? Is she going to live? Because she had put it all out there. And it probably took a minute or two for her to come to. And then it was like a moment of real rejoice because she's alive. And I mean, that was just the coolest. I could not think of a better conclusion to to the event, really. So
much drama, so much magic out at the Barclays this year. Just incredible. I got goosebumps hearing your recollection of those moments. Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So Jared, you know where we are right now?
We're at the tail end of your podcast where you want advice. Tell me the name again.
Hiking hacks.
That's right. It's like you're a regular listener, Jared. It's time for your hiking hack, and this segment is sponsored by the outdoor clothing brand Magnet Designs. Through hiker owned and making quality ultralight craft outdoor gear by hand in Bend, Oregon. Designed on trail, built for trail life. Visit magnetdesigns.com with no E in designs. So, Jared, what trail wisdom do you have for our listeners to make their next outdoor adventure even better?
I think the thing I would share with people, it's funny because I've talked a lot about preparation and homework and all this kind of stuff. But so it might seem strange to end on this note, but I also think it's important to not overthink things. And, I talk about Barkley being a filtration. It's a lot of things. One of the things it also is a test to see how people deal with stress. But when it comes to, I've observed a lot of people thinking that the solution and the answers to Barkley is some piece of gear, some formula, some recipe. And to an extent, you do need to figure out the recipe that works, the gear that works. But people sometimes miss the bigger picture, which is really to just get out there and spend the time in learning. And, at some point you just have to start and go try things and learn through trial, right? Some people training for a running race don't know how to get anywhere unless they have a coach to lay it all out for them. But I think the most important thing, and I never have had a coach. Everything I've ever learned is because I just went and tried stuff and usually failed at a lot of things. And so while you might take something away from this discussion, while you might learn things from books or coaches, at the end of the day, hiking and Barkley and running is about moving on 2 feet through wild terrain. And I would just say, don't overthink things if it's intimidating. Just get out there and start the process of learning. And you'll develop your own recipe. And maybe you learn things from me, but the key is just to start, to keep it simple. That first question about the one thing you'd bring, there's really just pretty simple things. So don't overthink your approach to things. Don't be afraid to just start and learn and fail. And that'd be my advice for people.
That is a solid hiking hack. Thank you so much. So there you have it. We're just about done here. Hope our listeners enjoyed our time with Jared. I want to thank him for joining us this week. Jared, how can our listeners keep up with you on social media, and where can they find updates on your latest adventures?
Well, yeah, so I'm really only on Instagram. I was kind of known forever for not being on any social media, but you can find me on Instagram. That's where I tend to post. It's a mix of athletic things, but also a lot of family things. That's a big part of my identity. So they can check me out on Instagram. It's Deraj, which is my name backwards. Jared backwards. DERAJ SLC, which is Salt Lake City. That's where I've kind of lived and been my whole life. So Deraj SLC on Instagram.
Fantastic. Remember to check out Hiker Trash Radio on social media as well. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. If you have comments or clips you want to share with me, you can send it to me at hikertrashradio@gmail.com.
Off the beaten path.
Now, unfortunately, Jared, we can't always be on the trail, and when we're not, we need to find a way to get our adventure fix. So I'm going to be looking to you to share some outdoor adventure media with a Barkley flavor to it with our listeners to help them get by. This could be a book, a movie, a documentary. We call this segment Off the Beaten Path. Any good Barkley adventure media out there?
Well, when I got into it, I read a lot of the old classic trip reports on Matt Mahoney's website. So that's kind of a fun historical spot to start. It's not like the way you normally consume media. I'd like to start there. I think of all the documentaries that are out there, I think the Gary Robbins one, Where Dreams Go to Die, is a fascinating one, because it really is a story about how you handle failure. It seems like every year there's 3 or 4 documentaries made, but I love that one, mainly because Gary's a good buddy of mine, and I think it focuses on the real Barkley challenge, which is, for almost everyone who ever starts it, is how do I deal with failure? We've talked, you brought me on the show because I finished 4 times, but the reality is Barkley is a test of how you manage and handle when things don't go your way. And I love that documentary for that reason. And I love Gary Robbins for that reason, because I've never seen someone handle multiple, upsets there better than anybody, with grace, with poise, with honor. It's incredible. Great documentary, Where Dreams Go to Die.
He is a fascinating guy, intriguing. I'd love to have him on the podcast sometime. I need to figure out a way to get a hold of him, but that is a great recommendation. One of my favorites as well.
What have we not asked you?
And one last segment for you, Jared, before we wrap things up, called What Have I Not Asked You That You're Dying to Tell Us About? What did we miss tonight?
Good question. I think we've touched on a lot of things. We haven't talked a whole lot about, I guess I mentioned the whole parenting component of this, but the integration of your kids into your life and your kids into, how about this? As you do evolve and do something as long as I have, how your approach to the sport or the things you get out of it evolves. And, the why changes over time. And, the why for me when I first did Barkley and first did other races was all about this personal challenge. But I guess if you were to ask me, like, how does the why shift and change over time? What's fascinating is to be, in my 40s now, mid 40s, and my why, well, I went into it wanting to personally finish, to a big extent. I think my why becomes one more of like the act of finishing. What does that mean? And what can that teach somebody else? What can it teach my daughters? What can it teach, students that I love to go talk to? And so it becomes less about putting another feather in your hat and more like building this story that you can share with people, especially younger people, to help them, help the next tomorrow's generation go do things they didn't think they could. So I guess the question in there was, how does your why evolve over time? Maybe a good question.
Well said, sir. Well said. Hey, we are finished. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast, Jared. We wish you the very best in your future adventures, and we'll hope you come back. I want you to commit to coming back on the podcast and sharing some maybe rock climbing adventures, some big wall adventures, and also the story of how you got lost in 2013. You mentioned that. You said that's a story for another podcast, so we're going to have to hold you to that.
All right. Yeah, sounds good.
As we close up, any shout outs to friends or family?
We'll do a shout out to Gary Robbins. It'd be great to have him on your show. I'm sure.
Fantastic. All right. Hey, thank you for tuning in, everybody. Always remember, the trail is the trail. It doesn't care if you want to go downhill. It doesn't care if it's almost dark and you're looking for a campsite. It doesn't even care if the lug nuts are coming off on Loop 5 in Frozen Head. The trail is the trail. Embrace the suck.